Fadi. I'm Research Associate at Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and also I'm working in the Political Science Department. Today we are very happy to have a distinguished scholar speaking on the issue of South Africa and comparing it with Palestine, and we will get to know a lot about the lessons that we can learn from South Africa. In the beginning, I would like to say that SIGA organized a seminar series, which is today. We organize this almost every 2 weeks, or 3 weeks sometime. 2 weeks ago we had a lecture by two distinguished scholars, Dr. Saif Abdel Fattah, one of the most important political scientists in Egypt, and Dr. Sami Al-Aryan. And we had a discussion about what is happening in Egypt, because we know there is some unrest in the country and the possibility for a new revolution. Today we will have the lecture on South Africa, with comparing it with Palestine. In 2 weeks also we will have a very distinguished scholar from Sweden, very prominent in political theory. His name is Erik Ringmar. He's very known professor writing about political theory. He will be talking about exploring non-Western international relation theory, re-examining the concept and paradigms. This will be in 2 weeks almost. From now, we will announce this in the next 2 days. Today, I would like to ask Dr. Sami to come to the floor. Dr. Sami is the director of Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and he is also public affairs professor at Zion University. He will have a conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. Please come to the floor. You can keep tracking our activity about SIGA seminar, and lecture through social media. You can follow SIGA Istanbul, Twitter, and Facebook. We are very happy to have distinguished scholars today, and they will have a kind of conversation, and then it will be followed by question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fadi. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's my pleasure to have with us today a very good friend and distinguished person who really not just represent South Africa, but he also represents generally, and I have seen that firsthand, Muslims from this part of the world and also in the West. Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool has a long and distinguished history in the struggle against apartheid South Africa. His upbringing was, and I will talk to him briefly about that, within the Islamic circles and Islamic movement, but he also realized that the struggle is not just about a minority community. As you know, Muslim community in South Africa is less than 2%, but the struggle was a universal struggle. So he, along with other people, have seen early on that the struggle is a universal struggle, and therefore we have to also be part of that universal struggle. So he was a person who realized this at a young age, and he joined the ANC, the principal organization that was fighting for justice and equality and freedom. And throughout that struggle, he, and along with his other brothers and comrades, asserted the presence of Muslims in that struggle. Also, after that, he was the principal candidate to lead the slate of elected officials in Western Cape. Western Cape is one of the most important provinces, and he was the candidate. It's also the most difficult to win. Even today, it's on an ANC. Yes. And yet, after a good campaign, they won, and he was the premier in that Western, meaning the governor of that province for about 4 years, I believe. And there's a funny story, because Obama came during that time. He was just a junior senator that no one heard of and no one really cared about. So it was Ambassador Rasool who actually took care of him, and he was taking him from place to place to show him where other politicians didn't care. And of course, 2 years later, everybody wants to meet Obama, so he was the perfect candidate to become the South African ambassador to Washington and to represent, and we probably can hear about his experience there as well. So what we're going to have today is basically a conversation. Of course, Ambassador Rasool after that became a distinguished professor at Georgetown, and now he is back in South Africa, also leading many functions within the ANC. So I would like to start, Ambassador Rasool, to give this audience a little bit of history maybe a few minutes about the struggle to apartheid South Africa. If you put us in the context of what happened between the arrest of Mandela all the way to the release of Mandela, it's 27 years in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Dr. Sami, thank you very much for being such a wonderful host for the last few days here, intellectually stimulating. I often go to conferences and I wonder, what do I learn? I've gone to contribute, but I've not always learned, and this was one conference I felt I needed to be in every session, because every session was like a master's degree to me. So thank you very much for that inspiration. Secondly, for hosting this extra day and tiring out your staff like 2 years, even more. And most importantly, for agreeing to change the format. I thought that we had had lots of lectures, but no real interrogation, no real conversation as this. So thank you very much for agreeing to do that. I want to say that Muslims in South Africa have been there for about 350 years. We came there 350 years ago as slaves of the Dutch. They colonized Indonesia and they colonized South Africa, and they needed labor, and the labor they brought were the Malay slaves, the Malay people from Indonesia. My grandmother's family came from Java on the one side, and then they had a colony in which they could also solve their political problems by bringing the outspoken ulama, the outspoken royalty who were fighting Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, by bringing them as exiles to South Africa. For the first 150 years or so, Islam was banned. You could not practice it. You could not pray. You could not, and therefore, if you come to Cape Town, you will see the graves of the awliya. We call them the awliya, the saints, the forebears, on the outskirts of Cape Town, high on the mountains, far out, because that was where they retreated to in order to practice Islam and to teach Islam. And they welcomed all the freed slaves who came there for those purposes. So, if you want to speak about Islamophobia, think about 150 years. But out of that, developed probably the most innovative, not in the bid'ah sense of the word, but the most innovative, creative practice of Islam. Islam became musical. The slave owners on Eid, they thought that the slaves were singing, but they had turned the takbir into music. On Maulud, they thought the slaves were singing, but they had developed the most beautiful qasidas and salawat and so forth and so forth. And they thought that they were singing, but they were developing the most musical adhkar, the remembrance of God. I just think that that is the kind of background from which I come. So this was a community born into hardship. In fact, it was so tough. One of those saints, we call him Tuan Guru, Mr. Teacher, but Qadi Abdul Salam, who from memory wrote the Quran word by word.
I saw that.
You saw that Quran. And apparently it has only 8 typographical mistakes in it, just from memory, and stand in the Oval Masjid. And you saw that there. But Qadi Abdul Salam, the scribes, now we know the binaries, Darul Islam and Darul Harb, the abode of Islam and the abode of hostility. He described Cape Town in that time as Darul La'na, the accursed abode. So hard was it to be Muslim. So that summarizes just where that comes from. Then, when we confront apartheid, when successive generations of discrimination emerges in South Africa, Muslims are wired to detect injustice. They don't always have the courage to act against it, but they can recognize injustice. And so we begin to find people like Dr. Abdurrahman, a Muslim who founds the Colored People's Congress and leads it. which makes an alliance with the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, which makes an alliance with the South African Indian Congress, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi when he came to South Africa in 1906, and starts the Congress in South Africa, and then founds the Congress in India. And so essentially, this is the confluence of factors that go into our mix. Of course, Nelson Mandela emerges as the big fighter, volunteer number one, not president, not chairman, nothing, volunteer number one of the anti-apartheid struggle. And we know, of course, in 1964, Nelson Mandela is sentenced to a lifetime imprisonment.
And he was basically given the image of being a terrorist, a radical, a Marxist, a Leninist, isolationist, racist, and then somehow throughout the years that image has completely transformed into the image of the anti-apartheid struggle. Walk us through how this happened.
Look, I think that the world that Nelson Mandela is jailed is a world in which there's segregation in the United States, when segregation is not only practiced but it is legalized. Martin Luther King and everyone else, Malcolm X, all of them are fighting it, but effectively the superpower of the world practices this kind of racism, and so our racists outdo them. They make apartheid a science. They make it so precise that, for example, it determines which areas are for blacks, which areas are for coloreds, which areas are for Indians, and which areas are for whites. It determines not only segregated schools, but which subjects should be taught. So, for example, if you think we have a skills crisis in South Africa, you must remember that for the whole of the apartheid years, blacks were not allowed to be taught math and science. So Nelson Mandela had to train the first math and science graduates for blacks in the first 12 years plus 4 years at university before they could go back to teach math and science in the schools. And so this was how refined apartheid was, how targeted it was, how scientific it was, and it determined who you could marry. They would even do blood tests to test whether you were of the same race. And they developed the Immorality Act. The only people who stood up against the Immorality Act, if two Christians of different colors wanted to get married, they converted to Islam because the Imam was duty-bound to marry them whether they were across the color line or not. That was the kind of ways in which Islam may have been unbanned, but it was still not recognized. And so right up to 1991, when my daughter was born, and my daughter, before we knew Tahrir Square, we called it Tahrir to celebrate our freedom. In 1991, when I went to our Internal Affairs Department to register her birth, I was forced to tick the box illegitimate because the Muslim marriage was not recognized. Now this was how apartheid was. And that's why I would be very fascinated, Dr. Sami, to try and understand what would be the equivalent in your Palestinian experience, given that you're a victim of that Nakba.
Well, obviously I wasn't raised in Palestine, but I was raised as a refugee.
Yeah.
So having that, I have experienced racism in Kuwait, where I was born. I experienced it in Egypt, where I was raised, because I had the grades, but I couldn't get into university. So I had to find my freedom, actually, and the major that I want to major in was in the United States. So I was there, I excelled, I got to the point where I was an academic, and then I had another kind of racism, because I became very vocal, you know, and then I ended up in Turkey, and thank God I'm embraced in Turkey. So that was the ultimate. This is in a few sentences, but we talk about the Palestinian experience, of course, especially today. You know, I want to hear, of course, more, you know, about this apartheid, but in the same scientific methodology, you're talking about racism, structured racism, is what we have in Palestine. It's settler colonialism. Palestinians have been, 2/3 of Palestinians were deported and exiled in 1948. The rest of Palestinians were occupied in 1967. Between 49 or 48 and 66, those who were left behind as Palestinians, they were under military law. Just imagine you have a country, a segment has all the freedoms to settle, to work, to do whatever, to bear arms, and the others are under strict military confines. They are under strict curfews for 18 years. And then they were given the citizenship and under restrictions, including marriage laws. Now the people who were occupied in '67, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Of course, Gaza Strip now is a different situation under siege, but within the West Bank, you can't build, you can't, they have different roads for Jews only and roads for Arabs. You have to go around to get to your work with this huge wall that was built in 2004, 2005. So basically you have a very similar, not exact, but very similar, and to some who live there, especially a lot of Jews tell us it's even worse than apartheid in many instances because of many things. And I want to do this comparison specifically because you were a majority, and those who were under apartheid laws, and eventually people saw that this is unsustainable. And when the wall break down, the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw something there that you can actually now fight. That this whole international thing, that was them trying to go and fight the communists, or be at least a wall against the influence of communism, that is no longer valid. And you saw victory. You told me. But in Palestine, the image is different. But I really would like you to tell us about some of the lessons that you saw in apartheid that could be applicable to the struggle in Palestine.
Let me just respond to you. If it looks like apartheid, feels like apartheid, smells like apartheid, and is implemented like apartheid, it probably is apartheid.
Even Carter called it apartheid.
Even Carter called it apartheid. I've resisted the use of the word apartheid for Israel because I thought it was an intellectual shorthand to avoid analysis and so forth, that people were just grabbing from a known pathology of the world, a known evil in the world, and that they were trying to apply it, and that it was a break. But I think increasingly we are beginning to see it even begin to supersede apartheid, get worse than apartheid, because, for example, we had the 1913 Land Act, kind of 70% of 87% of the land was actually forcibly removed from black people. We were confined to 13% in homelands. Those homelands at least had a sense of autonomous self-government. They were largely subsidized by the apartheid state, but that was to look after people. And so I think that is definitely a very important parallel between the two systems. I think we've spoken about the social discriminations, the educational discriminations, etc. We, at least the white apartheid government, yearned to be seen, to be civilized, because they had set themselves out on a Christianizing and civilizing mission in South Africa. That's how they sustained it. They were bringing Christianity to South Africa, and they were bringing civilization to South Africa.
The white man's burden.
The white man's burden. I think that they never fired rockets at us. They never dropped bombs on us. I mean, this is something beyond our imagination as black South Africans. And while they tried to confine us, there was never an attempt to exterminate us. It was about controlling us, not exterminating us, because we were just so many. And so I think that this thing about the parallels are absolutely crucial. But one of the most important foundational lessons that we had to learn, and that I think Palestinians have learned and are grappling with and are looking for methodologies on, is that we made an intellectual, political breakthrough in our thinking when we realized that after the Mozambican and Angolan revolutions, and the Portuguese, who were their colonists, all went back to Portugal. We asked ourselves the question, where are our colonials going to? And then we devised the theoretical notion that we have a colonialism of a special type. We called it by another name internal colonialism, because in a sense, the white Afrikaners who were oppressing us had nowhere to go, that they were there to stay.
Settler colonialism.
It's settler colonialism, and that therefore, whatever strategies we have and whatever struggle we have, how do we factor in this notion of settler colonialism and the fact that they are there to stay? Now, that I think is an absolutely crucial mechanism for us, because it divested us of the idea of driving them to the ports to take the ships back to the colonial center.
Many of them left, right? Many of them left after 94?
No. Most of them left before 94. Because what happened is that, and this is maybe something, we were able, because they needed this massive army to do what the United States wanted them to do, go and fight communism. The Cubans, the Russians who were in Angola and so forth, they needed to feed this army, but they only fed it by conscripting. Not enlisting, but conscripting white teenagers. At the age of 18, if you were white and you were a man, you went to the border. Not to train only, but to go and fight. And then they will bring them into the townships to suppress us. And so lots of white youngsters who didn't want to go to the army, that's when the first waves of whites left. After 94, another wave left.
The ANC started as a militant paramilitary organization at one point, and then you have to do the adjustment. Tell us about this period, and what strategies did you employ so that you can widen the appeal to the outside world, as long as to engage more people in the struggle?
So the ANC was born in 1912, and they were a group of gentlemen from the church. And so what they did was they wrote petitions to the Queen, Your Majesty, please save us, or King George, please save us from this, etc., etc. Then, when the mines were in full swing and black labor came to the mines, the ANC became largely worked with the trade unions, forming trade unions, and strikes were the order of the day, withholding your labor. That was in the 1940s, but it still sought to do. This is where the first internal revolution happens. Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and others are members of the ANC Youth League. And they decide that Dr. Moroka, who is the president of the ANC, is too much of a pacifist. And so they go to Dr. Moroka and they say, unless you change strategy, we will remove you as president. And of course, Dr. Moroka tells him to go away. He's not interested. He's on, and then the ANC in the 1950s makes its first break with its history. It basically deposes Dr. Moroka as president, and that's when they usher in a period that I call your kind of classical non-violence. They followed the Mahatma Gandhi route, and when there's a white post office, blacks go into it. White trains, we go. And we say to the police, arrest us. And it's a civil disobedience campaign during that period. Of course, that era is a short-lived 10-year era, because by 1961, they massacre at Sharpeville and across the country all the people who are burning their passes. And this is another parallel. with the Israelis. We needed passes for blacks to move from one place to the other. We didn't have walls, it was that pass and the ever-present police checkpoints and so forth. So that's another parallel. But they massacre people, and then Nelson Mandela and others come together and say they speak only the language of violence, and Nelson Mandela is asked to go and to form the ANC's guerrilla army. He goes and he meets up in Algeria with Ahmed Ben Bella, who becomes a great friend of his. He goes to meets the Palestinians in the camps of Algeria, and that's where he and Yasser Arafat become really, really good. I had the great pleasure of being the fly on the wall in 1991 when Mandela and Arafat reunite in Egypt, and the conversation they have about tactics and strategies and so forth. And then and so the ANC changes into this guerrilla army. But by the 1980s, it was clear that the power in the streets, especially after 1976, when young people showed that they were willing to die, protesting against the education system, the trade unions protest. So I think what happens from 1976 onwards, a concept is born in South Africa called militant nonviolence. Now this is no longer passive resistance. This now becomes militant nonviolence, and we say, let's not, because the apartheid state was saying to us, here is an invitation, please meet us on the battlefield. We have our tanks, we have our guns, we have our soldiers, come and meet us there.
So we're using mostly civil disobedience type tactics, but this was born out of a strategy that you decided on. It wasn't something that came spontaneously, right?
No, I think the 1976 students showed us the possibility, and we refined it into a strategy.
So tell us about who refined it, how it was refined, and how did Mandela himself change from one type of leader into another?
So Mandela was a leader that the greatest gift he had was to understand the pulse of the people. Now there are two kinds of leaders. There's populist leaders who hear what people are saying and then they repeat it back on a megaphone. So if they hear people say, take back the land, then they say, we shall take back the land. Kill all the whites. Then Mandela would say, kill all the whites. That's a populist leader. Mandela was a popular leader because he understood the anger of people, but he could give it a direction. He could triangulate it between the anger of the people, the morality of the struggle, and the strategy at our disposal. So between those three things, that was the gift of Nelson Mandela. So that he understood that in 1950 when he said to Dr. Moroka, you better resign as president or change the tactics. He could see that after the Sharpeville massacre, he could see the anger, he could understand the morality, and that's why even when he made the decision to found the ANC's army, the instruction was, we only attack military installations and armed personnel. There's no such thing as victims of the crossfire. And so that... There's no collateral damage. And then the third change that happens, he sees what the Soweto students were able to do, the anger on the ground. Secondly, he understands the morality that we are not a violent organization. And thirdly, he says, but here is a new strategy for us. And so the strategy that comes out of the ANC is this militant nonviolence. How do we make apartheid unworkable and the apartheid state ungovernable? And so rent boycotts get started, school boycotts. And that's how I ended up in the struggle, because I entered high school in 1976. That's when I had my first taste of tear gas, of rubber bullets and underground. By 1980, I was the leader of our school's boycott, part of a committee of 81 schools all over the Western Cape on a 12-week boycott. And because of the kind of morality of our struggle, we boycotted the school from 8 o'clock in the morning till 2 o'clock. And then from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock, we taught the lessons that the students missed, we ourselves. We took the clever children, teach us math, teach all progressive teachers.
How did you do this? How did you do this?
How did we do this? So we were in school from 8 o'clock. But
refusing to learn.
No, refusing to learn, but having political programs. So we would get, the morning would be devoted, the grade 8s to 10s would be watching a movie like a famous one, Battle for Algiers. It was a very famous one for them to go and watch. First, even Sylvester Stallone had some use for us in that, but to build up the levels of militancy and to give direction to the anger. As I was saying to an earlier meeting, we have a saying in South Africa that says, your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. And so how do you make the anger cook? You must give it direction, focus, and discipline. And so that's what we were, and then we'd have lectures and lessons in another part of the school going on. And so I was secretary of the SRC and coordinating this morning program, and then we coordinate the afternoon program where the clever children were teaching the rest of us math and science and English and the set works and all of those kind of things. So effectively, we were beginning the process of making apartheid unworkable and ungovernable, and this created enormous problems for the state, because it wasn't just that there were unruly people, and they were not paying rent.
So the issue for you was how to collapse the state and still keep yourself in a struggle without collapsing the living of the people, or how they live, and how people sustain themselves. If you start the process of civil disobedience, those people who work, who cannot earn money, how can you balance the two? On one hand, you're trying to collapse the state, because this is a struggle obviously with the Palestinians today. If you do the parallels, you'll find that the Palestinian Authority is now being basically an agent for the occupation. You know, they basically sort of given the issue of protecting the occupiers by subsidizing them. They give them certain money. They collect Palestinian taxes from the Palestinians. They give it to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority employs hundreds of thousands of people. They give them salaries, and they spend on their schooling and other means. And now it becomes a 5-star occupation. They don't have to worry much about it, but what they have to do is to corrupt few individuals within the Palestinian Authority and take care of business. And Palestinians only live on 3% of the land. So, you know, they can contain them. And the same thing you had like bento stands, and they don't have to worry about this. They have separate roads, separate schools, separate everything, and then they just enjoy the fruits of the land and everything else. So I'm trying to do the parallel here. How can you do something that would be civil disobedience where it's not affecting, you know, the occupiers themselves? So I'm trying to understand.
Look, in our case, South Africans were willing to make enormous sacrifices. You know the saying, if you don't have much, you don't have much to lose. And because ordinary South Africans did not have much to lose, they were far more stronger on the boycott campaign, even if they were going to be hurt. And the second thing is very important for a liberation movement. It is to show that their suffering will be finite. If there's a sense that the suffering is going to go on, and the leadership does not have the confidence of the people that this leadership is capable to lead us to the end of the struggle, people will not make sacrifices for that leadership. In our case, people made sacrifices because we communicated to them the ongoing weakness of the apartheid state. The apartheid state itself was, the more propaganda it sent out, the more we felt really great that we were denting them. But we were denting them because when citizens of Soweto refused to pay rent, they lost millions of rands. When blacks refused to pay taxes or make
Rand is South Africa's currency.
Yeah, the South African rand would be our currency. They lost millions of South African rands. They lost millions of South African rands in terms of not paying school fees, not helping to administer apartheid. We knew we were oiling the wheels of apartheid, and even our business class would find ways of cheating on the taxes as a legitimate tool, because of
let me ask you about collaborators. I'm sure you had collaborators within the movement, or within
that depending on where you look at it, that would be one of the unfortunate episodes.
So how did you deal with it?
That's the unfortunate episode, because there were some people who were so angry. The first batch of collaborators, they treated them to a treatment called the necklace, which is they put petrol-soaked tires around them and set the tires alight.
So they used violence.
They used violence because the anger against your neighbor who gave your son's name to the security branch, who then either killed your son or took your son away, that anger was so personal because you saw the perpetrator. There were 1 or 2 times that, that Archbishop Tutu intervened to stop someone from being necklaced. So the leadership really moved to these places to stop this necklacing. But by the time that we were able to stop it, the fear of collaborating was so high that we had relative assurance that you had to be exceptionally brave to collaborate with the apartheid state. And we regard that as an unfortunate episode in our struggle, even though it proved to be...
So the problem, yes, in the Palestinian side is that if the collaborator is the leader, so how can you even deal with that? So if you have collaborators among people, okay, you can deal with them. You can.
I certainly would not suggest a necklace.
No, certainly, no one is suggesting, civil war within it, but it's a tough problem, and they were able to basically control the people through this class of people who have been deceiving in the Palestinian side for the past 27 years or 26 years.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
Is there a way to make even the limited system in Palestine unworkable?
It's a very good question.
And ungovernable?
Yes, of course there is.
I'm not saying that I could suggest that because I don't understand those conditions, but what if similar conditions obtained that said make any administration unworkable?
It's a very good question. It's been tried. It was tried between 87 and 91, something called the uprising or the Intifada. During the Intifada, there was many things across the occupied territories that the occupation could not sustain or rule. You have to understand that the occupation only is using a few thousand people to maintain. But once you have a disruption to the system, then they have to mobilize hundreds of thousands. When that happens over 3 or 6 months, then the whole economic system is going to be strained, and maybe even strained to the point where it's going to affect the progress. That's why they were looking for a way out. The way out at the end was the Oslo process, in which they found their own Palestinian collaborators by which they can maintain the occupation and maintain their strategic objectives to the point where they do not have to strain their society. Is it possible to bring it back? Of course it is possible. The main hindrance, the main obstacle, the main problem here is really having this Palestinian, but by the way, this whole thing was done again in 2000. 2001 through 2002, there was another uprising in which, this time it was bloody. The other one wasn't really as much as bloody. I mean, there were a lot of Palestinian blood, but not much of Israeli blood. The second one was really bloody, and part of that, because Yasser Arafat decided that he's going to let everybody do whatever they want, he was tired of this Oslo thing. Then the Americans and the Israelis thought that we really need to control this. The only way we control this is by establishing a Palestinian security apparatus in which it will coordinate with the Israeli under what is called the security coordination, under the auspices of the Americans. And after that, it became very difficult to get anything done, because before you even, and the leader of the Palestinian Authority has mentioned many times, is that they have been able to thwart thousands of operations or things that would make the occupation pay for its occupation. So it's a big problem, and I'm trying to see if there's a parallel there, because if the leadership is part of your problem, You cannot even get to the occupation before dealing with Palestinians. If you really wanted to resist, you have to resist your people first before even you get to resist the enemy.
The closest we can come is the series of homeland leaders. Because here you had South Africa, the 13% of the land that was given to blacks were divided into a number of homelands. Transkei, Ciskei, Boputa, Tswana, KwaZulu, etc. All these Bantustans or homelands. They had administrations, they had armies, they had presidents, etc., etc. And so, but there was not an ambiguity about them. They had no credentials in struggle. There was no ambiguity about whether they were the good guys or the bad guys. They were unambiguously the bad guys. And so mobilization against them was very easy. I think there's an intervening step in the Palestinian situation because of an ambiguity. Can the ones who fought be the ones who sell out? Can the ones who have legitimacy in struggle be the ones to collaborate with Israel? That's the fundamental ambiguity that is different. In our case, literally it was black and white. In the Palestinian case, there's a lot of grey. And the struggle to clarify the grey is, I think, quintessentially the Palestinian challenge.
There is, of course, another layer of complication, is because you have what we, for the lack of a better term, those people who are more religious versus people who are more secular. So they came in two different camps. And because the people in Gaza, they have taken over, have become part of Hamas and the religious forces. And those people who do not like this kind of thing, you really don't have another champion. So there has to be another level of national movement that will go beyond the Fatah-Hamas dichotomy or duality, to the point where people could identify with this instead of trying to pick a side based on ideology, in which case they don't like these people, they're not going to join them, they don't like these people, and these people are collaborating, and they find themselves in the middle doing nothing. So I wonder also if you had that parallel, but somehow you were between a hard and between a rock and a hard place, and you're trying to find a middle ground where you can continue the struggle without having to be hit as hard.
I think that we understood after the banning of the ANC, the jailing of Mandela, and the Sharpeville massacre, and the exiling of the ANC, the rest of the ANC leadership out of South Africa, the ANC went into a trough, trying to find a new organizational form. It had to struggle for a new ideological base, etc., etc. And therefore we needed to rethink the very nature of the liberation struggle. The ANC had a very important set of conferences outside the country, in which, for example, it transformed itself from a Marxist, Leninist dominated movement to a far more national, soft liberal, not soft in the sense of gentle, but it adopted 5 freedoms.
So the change was from within.
The change has to start from within. Secondly, the ANC realized that even in South Africa, people were so scared of the ANC, and the job of branding the ANC as terrorists may have found some kind of resonance, and ordinary people felt, let's distance ourselves from it. And so the ANC had to, in a sense, soft pedal even on its military struggle. The third one was...
And that is because they tried to find the widest common denominator?
Absolutely. The slogan that comes out of the ANC is, unite anyone who wants change and isolate only the most dangerous of your enemies. And that was then a struggle that worked, because the apartheid state and its army was identified, for example, as the most dangerous enemy that must be isolated. They must not even have friends amongst other whites. That was when we started to reach out to, say, Helen Suzman, who was in the white parliament, but she was a lot more liberal, and we used her, for example, and it was very important. If Junaid is disappeared in South Africa, the white democracy allowed Helen Suzman to say to the Minister of Police, can you tell me about someone called Junaid Ahmed? And he was duty-bound to say, no, he is in this prison and that, and then at least his parents know where he is. So we utilized some of that. Then we said, let's spread our wings even further, unite all of us. That's when the ANC introduced also the notion of issue-based politics, because liberation movements want to fight struggles on its own terms. Let's get rid of apartheid, let's get rid of Botha, let's get power, etc. And the people aren't ready for it. So we said, no.
So what did you do with the militants within the organization? You fired them? You
No.
dismissed them?
There were two sets that we, in a sense, the one we invited to leave, the other one we expelled. The one set that we invited to leave was those who did not buy into the non-racialism of the ANC, meaning that they were still holding the idea that whites had to be driven into the sea. Because for as long as we had that idea, white people were sending their children into the army to secure their future. And we wanted to reverse that one. We wanted them to not want to send their children into the army. On the other hand, those who were hardcore Marxists, Leninists, communists, who didn't want the ANC to adopt a mixed economy and all of those kind of things, and constituted themselves as a caucus within the ANC, we expelled them. And so, with that kind of purification.
So you streamlined the organization, basically.
Yeah, we streamlined, made it a middle organization. In Arabic terms, we made them a force for Wasatiyah, and so they became a magnet for liberals in South Africa, for people who were white, but didn't want their children to go to the army. They would say, can the ANC help me with this? But we also changed the organizational form into something that we call the United Democratic Front. We hid the ANC because it was banned. To even wear its colors was to go to jail for 10 years. So we said, we can't endanger our people.
Okay, before we go and open it to the audience, I just want to touch upon the international angle.
Yeah.
Because obviously the struggle for the ending apartheid would not have been as successful had it not been for the international one. And of course today we have a wide Palestinian solidarity movement. We have the BDS movement. Do you see any parallels between the BDS and trying to boycott, sanctions, and divest, which is the essence of the movement, and what happened in South Africa? And where do you start? You know, obviously, at the end of the day, governments have to endorse these things, and today we find that there are many laws and many governments are trying to actually ban BDS because they're afraid that if this movement gets widely supported, that this is going to put a lot of pressure on them. So where do you see the parallels, and what do you think the Palestinians can learn from there?
I think that the parallels between BDS and the sanctions movement in South Africa are very clear. That's why, for example, 2 weeks ago, the Synod of the Anglican Church took a decision to endorse BDS and to not do anything with Israel. That's your mainstream Christian groups. We've had the Methodists do the same thing. We've had other church groups do the same thing, and so forth. So very clearly, I think in the global imagination, what we have not done and what I think we did, Archbishop Tutu, for example, when he went out to campaign for sanctions against South Africa, he said, if you don't give me sanctions, then I will have to tell the ANC that there is only a military way to solve the apartheid problem. You see, I think we have not made the alternative aware to the world. And to some extent, we've got to provide BDS as the safety valve, otherwise you have a vortex of violence eventually in not just Palestine, but wherever Palestinians are supported. The foolishness of letting them think that they can get away, because BDS is not, and we must not present it as an organization, because then you get locked up in the, it's a strategy. I wouldn't even say it's a movement, because otherwise those who don't like Farid Essak in Cape Town will say, no, this is Farid Essak, and so forth. Let's not support BDS.
Right.
So if you entwine it with personalities and organizational forms, you may, and movement issues, you may lose the impetus of the strategy. So how does BDS become the collective strategy of Palestinians and becomes the visible alternative to violence? Because those who ban BDS must take responsibility for what happens when you remove the instrument of militant non-violence. Because it is a strategy of militant non-violence to call for boycotts, divestment and sanctions. And I think that that is really the bell we must ring. For some who are peace-loving citizens of the world, it must be the wake-up call. And for those who support Israel, it must be the alarm bell. And I don't think, because we may have been too tied up to BDS as movement, as organization, we may have not presented it as strategy.
I mean, it's a strategy that could work also on other issues like Kashmir and others.
Yeah.
It's not just...
it worked in South Africa.
But it has worked in South Africa,
yeah.
And I think it's a good... but also, how were you able to penetrate Western capitals? Is that, if you first started with popular movements, you didn't get just to the governments, and through the popular movements, you were able to pressure the governments. Wasn't that the case?
No, I think we tried for a long time. I told you about the strain in the ANC that sent petitions to the Queen and delegations to the prime ministers and the presidents of the United States and so forth. And the fact of the matter is that they didn't care, or they were powerless to care. And that is when we took our struggle to the ordinary citizens. And part of it was to turn Mandela from terrorist to saint. And we needed to retell the story of who Nelson Mandela is, to humanize him. Because once, if he was just a symbol, people don't care. But when you humanize him, a man with children, a nobility, a lawyer, educated, this, that, and the other, in jail for 27 years, we humanized him, and suddenly the world saw Nelson Mandela. And when you sell him to a few global icons, like we did to Danny Glover, and suddenly we saw that Danny Glover and his partner in what's that movie? Anyway, not Police Academy. But suddenly it was beginning to be mainstream. They put Mandela's face in the movies. They put anti-apartheid signs in the movies. So it is to be able to create a popular narrative, to sanctify a leader, not because he's the leader, but because he becomes the icon of what you stand for, and then to present him to, and we said to Americans, we're not asking much. We're not even asking for your money. Don't just eat our apples. Don't just buy our goods. If someone is selling you something that was part of it was made in South Africa, say no. You've got other choices. And when you get people like that involved, I think capture, and this is what Nelson Mandela describes as a strategy to capture the moral imagination of the world.
All right, I think I'm going to open it now to the audience. A glimpse into the struggle, what happened in South Africa, and some of the parallels that have to Palestine. Certainly, the situations are not exactly parallel, but there is a lot of similarities. And certainly some of the tactics and strategies that were used in South Africa could also be employed in the Palestinian struggle, and also as well as other struggles. And of course, we did not touch upon the geopolitical struggle in Palestine, because in South Africa it was isolated in Southern Africa, where that geopolitical struggle was not, except in limited fashion, about Soviet influence. And once that happened, it was easier to deal with, but in Palestine you have this geopolitical situation where it complicates matters. And not to mention also the Zionist movement, that it's a worldwide movement, while this apartheid white South Africa was really limited to geography. But putting that all aside, we put all the issues here, and if anybody care to ask a question or make a comment, please do so. Anybody?
Well, I mean, I could allow others.
No, you get the first
very
crack.
generous.
You get the first crack. Go ahead.
No, this was absolutely phenomenal in such a short period of time, capturing how the my voice is loud, so we don't need mics. And of course, I learned a lot from I've known Ebrahim Rasool's work, and Master Ebrahim Rasool's, and other South Africans, and I think Dr. Sami will agree with me. They bring many insights that could be learned from for the specific struggles, not just the Palestinian one, but in Kashmir and other places that I think offer a fascinating paradigm of principled resistance to a whole system based on injustice and cruelty. And I think this is incredibly important after interacting with so many, my supervisor Abdul Tayyib, his work on Islamic resurgence and Islam. The one question that I had was studying the South African crusade for liberation, particularly the Muslim involvement, the different strands that emerged even within Muslims themselves. You had the Call of Islam, you were part of, you had the Muslim Youth Movement, you had a group like Qibla, these different groups within Muslims itself, and then the larger strands of, say, the Pan-Africanist, Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement, and then the Marxist-Leninists, the Communists. How did, because it was clear that post-apartheid even, the ANC clearly was comfortable in aligning with the South African Communist Party, with the South African Trade Union, COSATU. So how were they able to manage these differences and recognize the differences, but still consider this broad tent, all of these strands, as part of the liberation struggle? Never kind of denounce and condemn and have civil wars that were engineered to be part of them, you know, that happened in Palestine after 2006. Of course, it's getting, I mean, better in terms of overcoming those differences, but that's one of the, I think, things that we would...
And I really want to tie this point to the point of leadership, because I'm looking also at Palestine, and we're having a real difficulty in producing leaders, because the experience has been that you have this charismatic leader that is willing to compromise, and therefore after a while people lose faith and lose trust, and they are disenchanted because whatever they have been promised, nothing has come through. Then you have the Hamas leadership, which is really doesn't have the charismatic person, but it has a collective. But there's this person that people could wait to hear from, or at least look up to, is absent. So you have these forms of leadership, and we don't have a Mandela, basically. And not only we don't have a Mandela, we have a collaborator who's trying to present himself as being the leader and speak on their behalf, and promises them and just keep promising and promising and promising without any delivery. And then he is being empowered not only by the occupation but also regionally and internationally, and you are in this really very difficult situation where you don't have a vision, you don't have a, and that's even for the people inside the occupied territories, not even to deal with the 7 million people who are scattered around the world, who don't see anybody talking on their behalf, or even talking about their suffering. You know, in Lebanon and Syria, you know, 500,000 in Syria, they have been even at this terrible civil war suffering. No one even talks about their plight. Yeah, of course, in Lebanon, in Jordan, throughout the world. So it's very complicated all this. I'm trying to see if there are any lessons that we can learn. You know, having that, maybe not, maybe yes.
No, I think the important point is that particularly after 1976 to 1980, the ANC and Nelson Mandela was chasing to catch up with what the people were doing. The people particularly the students of 1976, 1980, my generation, and 1985, my wife's generation. She was in the SRC then. Mandela and the ANC were trying to catch up with us. And therefore, they were under pressure to change strategy within the ANC. They were under pressure to change the leadership of the ANC, not necessarily the people, but the leadership types. And they were under pressure to put their emblem on these struggles, to put a label on it, ANC. And they did this by making literature available about the ANC, and we were all attracted to this, not moderate, but this middle position that the ANC was presenting us between Pan-Africanism, black consciousness, Trotskyism, and all of those kinds. We said this is the middle ground, and so we rewarded them for changing their tactics to us, to give direction to our anger by saying, if you're comfortable with this, then we are comfortable with your name and we will carry your colors. Now, I think that we can't have a situation where the cart leads the horse. The horse is the people. And popular leadership is able to understand what the horse wants. Populist leadership will let the horse just run, and we're on the horse and we all say, this is it. Popular leadership will say, the horse must run, but let's put on some blinkers so that the horse is directed in a particular future. That's the difference between populist and popular. And so I think that for me, the Intifada had the potential of, for example, shooting Oslo out of the water. But somehow the horse was not blinkered but blinded. Because it was a horse that could have gone both ways. The horse could have been a response, a rebuttal to the Israelis who thought they could use Oslo to create the eventual one Israeli state solution. Or it could have been a redirection of the Palestinian leadership to create a genuine outcome by Oslo, and so I think that what you may be describing is a situation of us waiting for leadership change without necessarily setting the conditions, the ground on which that leadership will happen. Maybe you want to respond to that before we come to Sinead's question.
I think when it comes to Palestinians, the Palestinians are one of the people in the area who have sacrificed the most for the past 50 years. They have the unfortunate situation where they really don't have a real leadership for many reasons. I mean, part of it was that because of the interference of the regional powers who always tried to pick leaders for them. You know, all the regimes, whether it was Nasser in Egypt, whether it was Libya and Gaddafi, whether it was Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Hafez Assad in Syria, they played favorites. And we never had the opportunity because of the scattering of Palestinians throughout the world. Came along, Fatah movement and Yasser Arafat, who was a very pragmatic guy, and he had some vision, but he was also authoritarian, and he did not have a core principles by which, like Mandela, he's not willing to compromise. He was willing to compromise. He made a gamble and he lost. It's a huge gamble. He gave 78% of Palestine for the promise that he's going to get 22%, and in the back of his mind is that if I get 22% and legitimacy, I'm going to go and fight for the rest of it. He never even got that. And then I think he was probably killed at the end by Sharon to end that legacy, which is unfortunate. So, and then you have someone who replaced him who doesn't believe in any type of struggle whatsoever. He says the only way I don't believe in BDS, I don't believe in armed resistance, I don't believe in any kind of boycott, I don't believe in civil disobedience. What do you believe in? Negotiations, which has led to nowhere. 27 years, you have nothing to offer, you have absolutely nothing to give. All what you're given is security coordination only so that you can get the taxes from your own people through the occupiers so that you can control the situation. It's very desperate, in terms of leadership. And how do you get out of that logjam? I'm not sure. And then out of this, you have people who want to resist. They came in the form of Hamas or other groups. They were able to consolidate their situation in Gaza, but they're trapped. They're trapped within Oslo because they went into this and they had to agree, at least, even if they don't accept it, to the rules of Oslo in which they were elected. And they found out that this election is a fraud because no one really recognized them. So they got the responsibility without having anything to show for it. So they're in charge of Gaza without getting any resources. Qatar tries to help here and there. The only positive thing is that they live in relative freedom within their own, but they are under siege collectively, and that they try to rid themselves of collaborators, but with a great price to pay for themselves and the population. And now they're not very much loved because of the tough situation they are in. So you have a very difficult situation. Each one is different. But the Palestinians have been now, you could see isolated in 5 different situations. People in Jerusalem are different from West Bank, different from Gaza, different from outside.
No, I would never want to minimize the challenges that Palestinians are facing. I'm happy that we faced apartheid and that we were able to do what we could do. I would never know would I have been a successful activist had I been born in Palestine. And so that's the humility with which I really want to confess that. I would, for example, wonder, we know what Netanyahu's aim is. We know he's achieving it because it is like stealing candy from a child. The child will scream, but the candy will be yours. If we can, so we mustn't think like Palestinians. Let's think like Israelis who want Netanyahu to do something backed up by Trump. This, for Netanyahu, he has a window of maybe the next 6 or when is Trump's election? It's 3 years gone. Out of 8 years, he's probably got 1 to 5 years within which.
Hopefully.
No. But this is the gamble.
Yeah.
He believes that he has a window of 5 years to achieve the greater Israel. That's what Netanyahu believes. He believes that while Trump is there, he must accelerate settlements. He must get into the Jordan Valley. He must get into all the places that he has identified on his map as being greater Israel. He can do it by stealth, de facto create the facts on the ground, or he can do it by decree, by formal, it doesn't matter. He feels like Trump feels when Trump says, I can shoot someone on 5th Avenue and no one will care. Right. This is what Netanyahu says, I can take whatever I want here and no one will care. So if we can anticipate that this is the playbook as it will play out over the next few years, can we then anticipate what we need to be able to do as a resistance? And I'm saying all of the above strategy. What do we do at the United Nations? What do we do in global fora? What do we do in the region? How do we lobby the Washington and other places? How do we activate the solidarity movements that are there to say this is the playbook and we need the plan? And how do we create cross-Palestinian solidarity that may initially want to isolate the leadership that is in dispute, whether Hamas or Fatah, the PA or whatever. This has to be below that level, that we may need to say, can we build civil alliances as opposed to political alliances? We've put all our eggs in the political basket, they've crushed the eggs. Let's see if we can put it in a civil movement that could become the kind of resistance. I think we could be thinking about the kind of scenes. What's favorite on CNN? What grabs the emotion? Is it someone putting a flower in a tank? I'm just thinking about the Tiananmen Square. What is it that we need to ramp up, and how do we prepare the volunteers who would exhibit that kind of courage? Within all of that, we often had to make the very cynical, deliberative decisions about who on this protest must be prepared to go to jail. I would be told, Ebrahim, in 2 weeks' time we need you to speak here. You are not going to jail today. You will be in the backlines. But, you know, if we ask your mother to go to jail, that will really capture the headlines. Not that she's giving herself up for jail, but she's in the front row and more likely to be. And so it's really, struggle is not all spontaneity. There has to be design in it.
Okay, anybody else? Yes.
Charismatic personality, according to my opinion, the classification of such, it's not sustainable. Maybe the institutional mechanisms are more stronger. And the second point which I want to make is the scholars, who are the scholars. If they are put into activism, so the quality of scholarship it goes down.
You mean
These are my 2 points.
with activism it goes down? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
So you're saying that the role of scholars or elites with activism, that goes down because what? They lose their freedom, or they lose their ability to be independent? Why does it go down?
Then you are, I mean, the scholarship, which is more objective. If somebody is an activist, he has a set of interests and some sort of biases. So, if scholarship is brought into activism, then it has to be considered.
I mean, of course, the role of scholars is different from the role of activists, but obviously everyone has to be committed to their role. But there's definitely a role of scholars, and I want to ask you about the role of elites and role of scholars, enlightened. But what's your name?
My name is Faisal.
Okay, yeah,
Can I just say,
yeah.
I think that charisma is very important because it has the ability to inspire and the ability to move crowds that a scholar does not have. That's why the most charismatic orator that came at the right time was Alan Boesak. He was at that point elected the president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and he moved that whole alliance to declare apartheid a heresy. And the moment the word heresy was used, the moral capital shifted from the apartheid state to the liberation movement. So that was absolutely crucial. I think you're trying to make a distinction between something that is polemical and something that is scholarly. Some of the best scholars that we had in South Africa came from the struggle because they were able
Match words with deeds.
match words with deeds, because and we developed a category called organic intellectuals. Those were intellectuals who do, and that was, they found the nexus between theory and practice, and we called it praxis. And that is why the universities, in fact, Nelson Mandela's first Director General when he became President of a democratic South Africa was my boss at the University of the Western Cape, who in the early 1980s declared the University of the Western Cape the intellectual home of the left, meaning that scholars who were rooted in struggle and justice and freedom and liberty, they were allowed to come there. Others we will debate with. But this is, and so my job there, for example, was to prepare the post-apartheid. We had the education policy unit, and we got those people there. We had the best legal lawyers in the community law center at the university, and here were professors and scholars of the highest order sitting together and planning the future of a country. But they were, by day, they were in struggle and understood what was happening at the schools, and by night they could write up the syllabus for that struggle. And so I think that that's important. But let me just say that because otherwise you name things we're avoiding is question. The Muslim minority, as you said in South Africa, it's disputed, 2 to 3%. When we want Hajj quotas, we say 3%. When we read the census, we say 2%. But that's the size of it. It's disproportionately represented in the body politic of South Africa because, as I've told many audiences, everyone knows Nelson Mandela was in jail for 26 years. Next to him was Ahmed Kathrada for 27 years.
Foreign Minister today, she is a
foreign
Hijabi Muslim, right?
Yeah, Naledi Pandor is a Muslim, and we're trying to find a way for her to take progressive things without showing a Muslim hand. Because otherwise it will be not seen as intellectual policy, it will be seen as emotional identity. And so we need to save her from that. But the fact of the matter is, the Muslim participation in the last phase of struggle and in the post-apartheid phase, it was not easy. But what we did was, at the beginning of the 1980s, every Friday night, the leadership of these strands, Call of Islam, MYM, Qibla, and even some from the ulama, the MJC, would come together to debate these issues.
Did they?
Yes.
So they were open to dialogue?
No, they were open to dialogue, and some came to settle scores with each other and so forth. Some came to overwhelm each other. But the fact of the matter, and then later on Sunday nights at the Gatesville Masjid, we'd all gather with the whole public present to debate some matters in fairly great depth. And so at that point, our maxim was that ikhtilaf is that difference of opinion is a blessing or a mercy. That was what we did. But it didn't stop the MYM from expelling me when I was elected as the secretary of the United Democratic Front. They said I can't speak for them any longer. And that's when they expelled me, Farid Esak, and others.
MYM is Muslim Youth Movement.
So they were very Ikhwani inspired at that point, but we had seen the limitations because the Dawla Islamiyya wasn't a possibility, the Tarbiyah was very good but didn't teach us how to do the struggle, etc., etc. And so we formed the Call of Islam.
Yes.
Qibla was inspired by the revolution in Iran, and for them, one solution, Islamic revolution. And so they remained a fringe group. And it was at that moment that the Call of Islam seized the middle ground in alliance with the ulama. Because the ulama needed a lifeboat. Because they had been quiet. They had tolerated injustice. They had not even spoken when Imam Abdullah Harun was murdered under torture. In fact, the ulama issued a statement 50 years ago, almost to the day, to say that they are sure that had Imam Abdullah Harun been killed as an alim, they would have supported him, but he had been killed for his political activism. Now that was the situation, but here we gave them a chance to be good again. And so they opened the masajid. They didn't speak themselves, but they opened the masajid and allowed us.
During the struggle or after?
During the struggles. In the state of emergency. The mosque that my father was secretary of, we used that to launch the Call of Islam. Friday nights we could at short notice go there, etc., etc. And so there was lots of intra-Muslim debate. And when we went out, we had to present that the whole Ummah was with us in South Africa in order to convince South African blacks that the Muslim component was not a sellout component.
Yes.
And that is why when Nelson Mandela was freed and it was clear that a new constitution was to be written, and freedom was going to come, and a democratic government, he came to me and he said, Ibrahim, you know we are going to be free. I said, yeah, inshallah. And he said, no, 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 are the Muslims ready? I said, what do you mean, Madiba? And he said, no, do you know what you want in a new South, what do you offer the new South Africa? And that's when I convened in Cape Town for 3 days, 750 Muslim organizations, from the Murabi Tune on the one side, Qibla on the other side, every masjid committee, every madrasa committee, all came together, and we answered only 3 questions. We're not going to solve the Ummah's problems. The first question is, do we support the strategy to negotiate that Mandela is leading? Secondly, what are the values that Muslims want to insert into the constitution? And thirdly, what are the benefits that Muslims may want? And so on the first one, there was broad agreement, yes, this is the strategy. On the second one, we said dignity and justice and all of those kind of things, and we argued that, and we even shaped the form of secularism, because we said we don't want an atheistic state, but we also don't want a religious state, a theological state, a theocratic state. So let's cut out the extremes. What kind of secularisms are available? And then there was the Chinese world secularism, the laïcité, and then there was the porous world secularism, and we opted for the porous world secularism.
From the state to interfere into religion.
The state is above and equidistant from all the religions, and when Nelson Mandela accepted that, he inserted into the constitution all the religions are equal. When the Christians asked him, but Madiba, they are only 3%. He said, it is not the number of people, because that can change over time. It is the equal value of God. What if Muslims are the majority tomorrow and Christians are the minority? We must prepare for 100 years from now. And so forth. So that's been the kind of discussions we've been having.
I just want to end on an optimistic note. You know, I just finished the book titled Rise and Kill First, and the subtitle is The History of Israeli Targeted Assassinations. This, you know, they went back all the way from 1940s until 2012 or so, and 631 pages. 629 of them are very depressing. The last 2 pages where he gets a hope.
It's a lot of reading.
Yes, a lot of reading to reach the last 2 pages. And the last 2 pages basically say that we have won all the battles, but we're losing the war.
Yeah.
And to them is that despite everything they've done to suppress the Palestinians, kill the Palestinians, of course this is assassinations. And in that book they talked about literally thousands. You know, I couldn't even put my hands on it. You know, you think, and this is not the Mossad, by the way. This is the whole Israeli state. We talk about Aman, Shin Bet, Sariya Mitkhal, the Air Force. All of them were geared upon, and this is under all the leaders, not just one leader here or there. I mean, this is real targeting of not just Palestinians. Talking about across the Muslim world, including Iranian scientists, Algerian, you know, Egyptians, everywhere they were done. I mean, it's a killing machine.
Yeah.
But he said that is not going to do. Why? Because at the end of the day, Palestinians are still resisting. We're not offering them anything. You know, they're getting more than us. And at the end, we're going to end up by agreeing. And he mentioned apartheid.
Yeah.
The last page, you know, where he says that you know there is no way the world is going to accept something like this. And that's where you see a hopeful note that they know that this is, and of course, towards the end, I think the person who leaked all this information to him was a former Mossad, the one who probably killed the most Palestinians than anyone else, Meir Dagan. He died, and he was very bitter about Netanyahu, and he was saying that he's leading Israel into the end, basically. So you know, I want to end by saying that I feel the same struggle as Palestinians. We're really against an apartheid. We have different kind of challenges, but I think the path is the same. We have to go into this path. We're going to have a Palestinian solidarity movement, the same thing that we had a South African, you know, Black African, you know, the people of South Africa solidarity movement, where we were, you know, I lived that in the US in the 1980s. We were there in the streets. We saw people coming out. and how people gradually came. The last one to come around was Reagan, but that was to be expected, you know.
It was forced.
Yeah, it was forced actually, you know, because he started vetoing and all this, and then he tried to claim some credit for whatever reason. But I think this is where, you know, the path when it comes to Palestine, and I believe the same would be for Kashmir and others. The key is for people to resist and never to give up. As long as you don't resist and give up, as our brothers and sisters in South Africa have insisted, you know, eventually oppression would have to give in to this. I want to thank you, and if you have any final words.
No, I think what was
Yes.
in al-Batla kana zahuka. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
Thank you very, very much. I just want to make a final announcement here about our next program. This is on November the 5th. This is also the term week, but I hope that people can take an hour and a half, because we have a very exciting, very good speaker. As Fadi said, he is Professor Erik Ringmar from Sweden, and he is an authority in his field. And his field is to explore and understand the theories of international relations which are non-Western. You know, so the title of his speech is Exploring Non-Western International Relation Theories, Re-examining Concepts and Paradigms. So those who are in the field and were in political science, I think they will benefit a lot. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.